Hello everyone, and welcome to the 2018 World Chess Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana. This is game 11, and if you haven't been following the championship so far, I will put a link to all the 10 previous games in the description below, so you can follow it up if you feel like it. If not, all of the games so far have been drawn, so 10 draws in a row, and I believe this makes it a record regarding World Chess Championship matches. There have never been 10 draws in a row in a World Chess Championship match. It's still hard to say. If you ask either of them, they were asked in the press conference who is now the favorite here, as there are only 2 more games left before the rapid playoffs. But Carlsen is fairly confident, as one would assume. But Caruana says that his chances are not as low as everyone says they are. So before we check out the actual game, we do have a couple of nice photos. Again, compliments of Niki Riga. So let's check them out. Here we have a very nice photo. In this game, the first move was made by the 2016 World Chess Championship challenger. It is the man himself, Sergei Karjakin, and he also, like Woody Harrelson, decided to play a little joke. He opened with pawn to b4 for Carlsen. So quite a move from the former World Chess Championship challenger. As you can see, they are all really having the time of their life. Here you can see he checks with Carlsen. Is everything okay with the b4? Will he actually play it? Caruana most likely knows it's a joke, but you can never be too sure. This is the last time in the match before the playoffs that Carlsen actually has the white pieces, so he might even go for b4. You never know what's going on. You can see on his face that yeah, it's a joke, but it also might not be. Here we have a photo of Carlsen saying, Karjakin, why you do this to me? But later in the press conference, I've learned that Carlsen was actually informed some 2 minutes prior to this that Karjakin will pull this joke. Here you have Karjakin was also a guest in the official stream. There you have it. He's explaining to Judith and Anna why he made the little joke with the b4 move, how he has a lot of followers on Instagram, and also a lot of very cool stuff, how he was the better challenger in 2016 than Caruana is in 2018, and so on and so on. I actually totally made up the last 2 things, but I have no idea what they were talking about, so there you have it. So like we said, Carlsen has the white pieces, and he opens with not b4, the move Karjakin so conveniently, played, but rather e4. Again, Carlsen wants to test out Caruana's Petrov defense. Okay, e5, we have knight to f3, knight to f6, the Petrov defense is on the board, knight captures on e5, d6, and here Carlsen doesn't retreat like in the previous game where he tested Caruana's Petrov with knight to d3, but rather he goes to knight to f3. This is the classical variation, and now we have knight captures on e4. We have knight to c3, knight captures, d captures, and here this is my favorite line personally with the white pieces against the Petrov, as now well, it's a very enjoyable line to play. You can freely develop your bishops. It's a fairly open game. But if you play it like in blitz games, or if you play it against some weaker opponents, you will usually encounter this bishop to g4 move, where you can immediately punish it with h3. After black moves back, you will play queen d5, attack the bishop, attack the b7 pawn, and here if black wants to keep everything intact, he will have to give up the bishop here, and now you will have won the bishop pair. It will be fairly hard for black to develop. If knight c6, then bishop can come to b5. If c6, queen g3, again hindering black's development, so a very enjoyable position for white. But okay, after d captures on c3, bishop to e7 by Caruana, we have bishop to e3, and now Caruana castles. Queen to d2, and the knight to d7. This entire game has already been played before, but we'll get more into that a bit later. A queenside castle by Carlsen, knight to f6, and it's very interesting. If you remember that entire Videogate thing that was going on, where the St. Louis Chess Club leaked that footage where Caruana had some preparations and some of the lines were visible, so then everyone was like, was it done on purpose? So they would confuse Carlsen's team to prepare for lines that Caruana wasn't even planning, or was it just a silly mistake? Here it's fairly interesting. This knight d7 to f6 line of the Petrov was actually one of the lines shown in that video. What makes it even more interesting, after bishop to d3, what Carlsen played, here Caruana played c5, and again Caruana caught Carlsen out of preparation, because Carlsen was definitely not prepared for this c5 move, and here he took again some 10 minutes to muster up a reply. So very interesting. Here, this knight d7 to f6. You see it in Caruana's leaked video that regards this preparation of the Petrov line, and then, of course, you just don't prepare for it, which makes sense. Bishop to d3, c5, and here Carlsen simply goes rook h to e1. Also, an interesting line is knight to g5, simply, going for a very nice all-out attack, and after h6, it makes sense to play actually h4, and here if black captures, white would eventually end up winning this game. Now you will either have to give up the knight, or you will move the knight and then lose the game terribly after bishop to h7, king h8, rook h2, the other rook is coming to h1, and the black is getting checkmated. Problem is, after this knight to g5, black doesn't have to react in such a foolish manner. He can simply go d5, play a nice central move, and now the pawns are very dangerous here. He will simply ignore the knight on g5, and after something like king b1, he will also start attacking on the queen side. So it would result in a very double-edged position. Carlsen instead goes rook h to e1, and here we have bishop to e6, attacking the a2 pawn. King to b1, and now comes queen to queen to a5. And here black is threatening checkmate. If white makes a silly move, then white of course is getting checkmated here. So you have to play something. After queen a5, it's not all that impressive to go with something like a3. Then after c4, attacking the bishop moves, now comes knight to e4 with an attack on Carlsen's queen. Queen to c1, and now d5, and black is getting a lot of action going on in the center and also on the queen side. So here Carlsen is basically forced into the next line. He plays c4, offers a queen trade. We have queen captures, and here comes bishop captures on d2. And this is the move that Caruana was most likely super prepared up until this point. Most likely he was expecting for something like knight captures, and then after knight to g4, which is after the bishop gets attacked, b3 defending the c4 pawn, and then after knight captures, you will capture with the rook, and yes, black does get the bishop pair, but still white will play something like knight e4 to c3 to d5, and after this knight reaches d5, you no longer have the c pawn or the e pawn to get it away from d5. So at some point you will have to give up the light square bishop if you want to get rid of this knight from d5. So yeah, it would be winning a bishop pair, but not really. So okay, bishop captures here. Instead of knight captures, we have h6 by Caruana. It took him some 6.5 minutes for this move, and this is the first time that he actually spent time in this game. Also a known move here in this position, as there was already a game played with these exact same moves, is rook f to e8. It was played in the game Sasikiran versus Miroshnichenko in 2018 in the St. Louis winter event, and that game ended in a draw. So here Fabi goes h6, and now we have an entirely new game. This game is not available in any of the databases. And here, there's a lot of possibility here. Here we have knight to h4, and Caruana decides for rook f to e8. Of course, you have to notice that the g6 square is very weak now. If the knight comes to g6, then even if you capture the knight, the bishop on e6 becomes a target. So here, one of the moves that Caruana could have played is knight to g4, but knight to g4 is pretty much a forced draw sequence. After knight to g6, f captures on g6, rook captures on e6, and knight captures on f2. Going for the rook here, rook d to e1, going after the bishop on e7, and now knight captures on d3. C captures on d3, and now bishop to f6. Rook captures on d6, now comes rook f to e8, challenging white's rook on e1. Rook to d7, going after the b7 pawn, but now simply b6. And after rook captures on e8, rook captures, you will not be... Well, you're not going to achieve much by capturing on a7, because if you capture here, then rook to e2 is very strong, going after the bishop, going after the g2 pawn, and it will be, a drawish-like ending. So what knight to g4 would actually do here is force that drawn sequence. So rook to f to e8 was played by Caruana, and now comes knight to g6 from Carlsen. And here he does go knight to g4. If you go something like bishop to d8, simply move the bishop, then this knight is coming to f4 with an attack on the bishop on e6. After you move the bishop, captures, and after f3, controlling the knight on f6, you would have pushed back black's pieces somewhat, so maybe it would be better for white. But okay, after knight g6, we have knight to g4 finally. And now comes knight captures on e7. Rook captures and the rook to e2, defending the f2 pawn. Knight to e5. And here we have, again, a pretty much forced sequence that goes into a lot of trades. Bishop to f4, knight captures on d3, rook captures on d3, and now rook to d7. Of course, you cannot capture on c4. Here would be nice, but your rook is hanging on e7, so here you'd be just down a piece. So after rook captures on d3, rook to d7 was played, protecting the pawn on d6, as now there's actually threats of bishop capturing on c4, rook captures on d6, rook captures, bishop captures, but now rook to d8 first, as the bishop cannot move due to problems on the back rank. So rook to d2, defending. We have bishop captures on c4, as they decided to trade this d6 pawn for a c4 pawn. King to c1, preparing to defend the rook on d2, and now b6. We have bishop to f4, rook captures on d2, king captures on d2, and here we have an endgame with opposite colored bishops, where there are 3 pawns on the queen side and 3 pawns on the king side, so it's basically a perfectly, identical, not identical, but 3 pawns on the king side, 3 pawns on the queen side each, and each a dark square bishop. White's king is somewhat more active, but we'll see what happens. Here, an interesting move would be bishop captures on a2. It would be fitting, if Caruana did this the way Fischer did it against Spassky, but here it actually wouldn't work. After b3 and c4, you would get king to c3, and now after pawn captures, king to b2, and now the bishop is definitely trapped. You're threatening to capture on b3, and there are no tricks with pawn captures here, because you can simply capture it. The queening square is guarded by the bishop on f4. So here, after king captures on d2, we have a6 and a3. If you go for something like bishop to c7, it does seem like you're threatening to win a pawn. After pawn here, bishop attacks pawn. It doesn't really work because of bishop captures on a2. Now you can actually capture this pawn, as the bishop from f4 is no longer guarding the queening square. After b3, you can push c4, but now the same idea doesn't apply here. Pawn captures on c2 actually does work. Now you cannot capture the bishop, as black gets a queen into the game. So after a6, we have a3, and now king to f8. Fabi starts bringing his king into the game. Bishop to c7, now going after the b6 pawn, and yes, the c5 pawn will be lost with tempo, but again, you can give up one pawn, as it's an endgame of opposite colored bishops. We have b5, bishop to d6 check, king moves, and now bishop captures on c5. We have h5. Now, as Carlsen has a dark square bishop, Fabi wants to place all of his pawns on light squares, which is exactly what he will do. And Carlsen will at some point have to place all of his pawns on dark squares. At some point in the game, I might have said that they both have a dark square bishop, where in fact they are opposite color bishops. So, basically, I misspoke there. King to d7, king to d4, again bringing the king into the game. g6, putting the pawns on light squares, so they aren't targets in the future. g3, Carlsen does the same, bishop to e2, and now comes bishop to f8. King to c6, we have b3. You have to try at least something. If you immediately put all of your pawns just on dark squares, then it's a dead draw immediately. Here, Carlsen at least wants to try something with c4. We have bishop to d1. Now comes king to d3. Bishop goes back to g4, and now c4. We have bishop to e6, king to d4. We have pawn captures on c4, pawn captures on c4, and now bishop back to g4. We have c5. That c5 pawn is now very nicely protected on c5. And also one of the interesting things is that even if this king goes all the way to the king side, and the white king somehow tries to go over to capture the a3 pawn, as soon as this pawn is captured, then this comes with check, so also a thing to consider. Bishop to e6 by Caruana, bishop to h6, now comes bishop to d5, and now bishop to e3. Bishop to e6, and now king to e5. We have bishop to d5, king to f4, bishop to e6, and now king to g5. Here Carlsen has a very nice idea, but you'll see you'll see what happens. Bishop to d5, we have g4 by Carlsen, pawn captures, king captures, and now comes bishop to a2. An interesting maneuver would have been if something like king to d7 is played. Now comes f4. If Fabi just decided to repeat, king c6, we have h4, bishop to e4, king g5, bishop to d3, and now after f5, you would have this situation where if you actually capture the pawn, then white would have a winning position, because now h5 would be winning, just so you get an idea of how this entire situation can go wrong for black. So now, of course, you will either have to ignore the pawn and allow it to be queened, or you will capture it, and then white will capture this bishop and win the game. But, of course, Caruana doesn't go for that. He goes bishop to a2. We have king to g5. We have bishop to b3, king to f6, bishop to a2, h4 now. Bishop to b3, we have f4, and bishop back to a2. Again, interestingly, if you go bishop to e6 to prevent this pawn from coming to f5, you will face the same, idea, f5 simply. And now you will either have to capture with this pawn, and now there's no way of preventing this pawn from queening, or you will capture with the bishop, and then again h5 wins, as you will either have to let it slide all the way to h8, or you will capture and then lose the bishop. This pawn is protected. It's an easily winning game. Yeah, there are no chances here for black. But Fabio, of course, sees all that. He goes bishop to a2. We have f5 by Carlsen. And here, Fabio simply ignores him. Bishop to b1. Bishop to f2, and after bishop to c2, the players agreed to a draw on move 53, and as you can see, even game 11 was drawn. There's nothing really to do here. You can simply just move the bishop back and forth, or even if you exchange something here, push h5 or whatnot, it's still a draw. Nothing to be done here. But yeah, after bishop to c2, they agree to a draw, and there is only one more game left in the classical time format, and it's very interesting. So if you imagine, the match so far has been drawn, and now it's like the World Chess Championship is to be decided in one game, where Caruana has the white pieces. So if you look at it like that, Caruana is definitely a huge favorite now, as Carlsen has to defend his title with the black pieces. So far, I mean, he did create most of his chances with the black pieces, and most of the, creative games were where he had the black pieces. But also a very interesting aspect of this World Chess Championship match is that Carlsen always gets out-prepared by Caruana. So that's really interesting. Is it, I mean, what's the idea here? Is it due to laziness, due to bad work of his entire team? How does the other guy's team always out prepares you? And I mean, you're the world champion. You know, you definitely should not be out prepared so often in a World Chess Championship match. So very interesting. And again, it's very interesting that Carlsen actually decided to go for e4 in this game, as Caruana, being such an expert on the Petrov, it's hard to imagine that he could have hoped to achieve some advantage here with the white pieces. But yeah, I just think that by this point he already feels that his best chances are either in game 12 with the black pieces, where he either prepared something insane, or he will just go into tie breaks in faster time controls and look for his chances there. So I'm also very interested in what do you think, how this match is doing, where is this going, and feel free to share your comments in the description below. I would also like to thank Carsten Kurze, Lars Alsbach, Glenn Brack, Turkley Consulting, and James Pogue for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, hopefully with some more interesting content. Maybe even check up on some of your suggestions, as tomorrow is a rest day before the final game. Thank you all, and I will see you soon.